It is 865 AD inside a Danish longhouse. A messenger has just finished speaking. The silence is absolute, but the violence has already begun. 4 brothers sit around a table. They are the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. Sigurd Snake-in-the-Eye is holding a small knife, idly paring his fingernails. As the news of his father's murder sinks in, he doesn't scream. He doesn't look up. He just keeps cutting. He slices past the nail, through the skin, and carves straight down to the solid bone of his finger. He doesn't even feel it. Across the table, his brother Bjorn Ironside is holding a chess piece carved from solid bone. His grip tightens. There's a sharp crack. The chess piece explodes in his fist. Shards of bone drive deep into his palm and blood begins to drip rhythmically onto the wooden board. This wasn't grief. This was a declaration of war. This was the exact second the revenge of the Great Heathen Army began. To understand this bloody reaction, you have to understand the insult. The messenger confirmed that King Aella of Northumbria hadn't just killed Ragnar. He had tortured him. He had thrown the legendary Viking into a pit of vipers to die slowly, stripped of his armor and his glory. Aella wanted to prove that Ragnar was just a man. But with his dying breath, Ragnar laughed at his killer. As the venom took hold, he choked out one final prophecy. How the little piglets would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffered so. King Aella thought he was ending a threat. In reality, he was lighting a fuse. He forgot that the old boar had sons. And those piglets were now the most dangerous warlords in Europe. Over the next 9 years, those sons would launch the largest Viking invasion in history. They would destroy kingdoms, execute kings, and fundamentally change England forever. And every single person who played a role in Ragnar's death would die screaming. This is the story of how Ragnar's torturers died, how the Great Heathen Army hunted them down one by one, and how medieval warfare was changed forever by 4 brothers who refused to forgive. The reaction in Denmark was immediate. There were no tears. There was only mobilization. Sigurd pulled the knife from his finger. Bjorn wiped the blood from his hand. They sent out a call that reached every corner of the Viking world. This would not be a raid for silver or slaves. They didn't care about treasure. This was a mission with a single brutal purpose: extermination. Warriors flocked to their banner from Norway, Sweden, and Ireland. Rivals put aside old feuds. Mercenaries refused payment just to be part of it. They were all drawn by the magnitude of the target. King Aella believed he was safe in his stone fortress across the sea. He had no idea that he had just summoned a force unlike anything England had ever seen. The Great Heathen Army was launching, and they were coming to ensure that every single person involved in Ragnar's death would pay the ultimate price. In late 865 AD, the sentries on the coast of East Anglia looked out at the horizon and saw something that stopped their hearts. Usually, a Viking alarm meant 3, maybe 5 longships, fast hit-and-run raiders, but this time, the horizon itself seemed to be moving. Hundreds of dragon-headed prows cut through the mist. This wasn't a raiding party. It was a floating city, a migration of death. Historians call it the Great Heathen Army, but the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle simply refers to it as the Meisel here, the Great Host. It wasn't just warriors. It was smiths, women, children, and horses. They weren't coming to steal silver and leave. They were coming to take the land, burn the crops, and dismantle the kingdoms of England brick by brick. At the head of this massive force was not the strongest brother, Bjorn, or the most stoic, Sigurd. It was Ivar the Boneless. History has debated for centuries why he was called boneless. Was it a brittle bone disease that left him unable to walk? Or was it a metaphor for his unnatural flexibility in combat? The sagas tell us he was often carried into battle on a shield. But make no mistake, Ivar was the brain of the operation. While his brothers were fueled by rage, Ivar was fueled by cold, mathematical cruelty. He understood that to kill a king like Aella, you didn't just need axes. You needed a strategy. Ivar knew that Northumbria, Ella's kingdom, was too strong to attack directly from the sea, so he made a move that confused everyone. He didn't sail north to Northumbria. He landed his massive fleet in East Anglia, hundreds of miles south. He bypassed his target completely. Why? Because Ivar was playing the long game. He terrorized the locals of East Anglia, not into fighting, but into submission. He demanded horses. He turned his sea-borne infantry into a mounted cavalry. He spent the winter gathering intelligence, sharpening blades, and letting the fear of his presence drift north like a plague. He was letting King Aella wait. He was letting the dread build. Ivar knew that the anticipation of suffering is often worse than the suffering itself. By the time the snow melted in 866, the Great Heathen Army was no longer just a mob of angry Vikings. Under Ivar's command, they had become a professional machine of war, mounted, supplied, and hungry. They turned their eyes north. The little piglets were done grunting. It was time to hunt. While the Great Heathen Army was preparing in East Anglia, the kingdom of Northumbria was busy destroying itself. It was the perfect storm. The Northumbrians were embroiled in a bitter civil war. The usurper King Aella, the man who killed Ragnar, was fighting against the rightful King Osbert. They were so consumed by their hatred for each other that they didn't notice the shadow creeping up from the south. Civil war is a gift to an invader, and Ivar the Boneless accepted it with open arms. In the autumn of 866 AD, Ivar made his move. He marched the army north, utilizing the horses he had extorted from East Anglia. They moved with terrifying speed, bypassing smaller villages, aiming straight for the heart of the north, the ancient Roman city of York. But Ivar didn't just choose the target. He chose the time. He waited for November 1st, All Saints' Day. Consider the brilliance of this. On All Saints' Day, the entire noble class, the military commanders, and the bishops would be gathered inside the cathedrals. They would be unarmed, distracted, deep in prayer. They were expecting a feast. They were expecting divine protection. What they got was the heathen army. The Vikings struck York while the church bells were still ringing. The city's defenses were manned by skeleton crews. The gates were breached before the Northumbrian leaders even finished their hymns. It wasn't a battle. It was a massacre in a sanctuary. By the time the sun set on All Saints' Day, the capital of the north had fallen. But Ivar didn't burn York to the ground. That would be the mistake of a common raider. Instead, he occupied it. He repaired the Roman walls. He stocked the granaries. He turned York into a Viking fortress deep in enemy territory. He sat on Ælla's throne and waited. He knew that the fall of York would force his enemies to stop fighting each other and come to him. He was counting on it. He wanted Aella and Osbert to unite. He wanted them to bring their armies to the walls of York. Why hunt the mice when you can put down a piece of cheese and wait for them to come to the trap? It took 4 months for the Northumbrians to swallow their pride. 4 months of watching a heathen army sit in their capital, eating their food and mocking their gods. Finally, in March of 867 AD, King Aella and his rival Osbert shook hands. They combined their forces into a single massive army. It was a crusade before the word truly existed. They marched on York, convinced that God was on their side, ready to drive the pagans back into the sea. On March 21st, Palm Sunday, the Northumbrians attacked. At first, it looked like a victory. The Northumbrians slammed into the old Roman walls of York with the fury of desperate men. They found gaps in the defenses. They broke through the gates. A cheer went up from the English ranks. They poured into the city streets, thousands of them flooding the narrow alleyways of York, thinking they had the Vikings on the run. But they didn't understand who they were fighting. Ivar the Boneless hadn't lost the walls. He had abandoned them. He had invited the English inside. As soon as the bulk of the Northumbrian army was squeezed into the tight, winding streets of the city, the traps snapped shut. The Vikings appeared on the rooftops. They emerged from side streets. They locked their shields at both ends of the main avenues, turning the city of York into a claustrophobic killing ground. The advantage of numbers vanished. In the close quarters of urban combat, the long spears of the English levies were useless. It became a brawl of axes and knives. The panic set in immediately. The Northumbrians were packed so tightly they couldn't swing their weapons. They were cut down where they stood. King Osbert, the rightful heir, fought bravely, but he was overwhelmed in the chaos. His body was trampled into the mud of the city he tried to save. But amidst the carnage, the Vikings had specific orders. There was one man who was not to be killed quickly. The sons of Ragnar were watching the battlefield, scanning the faces of the dying, looking for one specific crown. King Aella saw his army disintegrate. He saw his rival die. He realized with dawning horror that the walls he had just breached were now his prison. He tried to retreat, but the path was blocked by a wall of Danish shields. He was surrounded. He was dragged from his horse, stripped of his weapons, and forced to his knees in the blood and dirt. The Battle of York was over. The silence returned to the city, broken only by the groans of the dying. The Vikings didn't execute Aella on the spot. That would have been mercy. Instead, they bound him in chains. They looked at him not with anger, but with a terrifying sense of anticipation. The war was finished. The ritual was about to begin. The Great Hall of York had seen many kings, but it had never seen a trial like this. King Aella was dragged into the center of the room. He was covered in mud and blood, his royal robes torn, his crown long gone. Around him stood the victorious chieftains of the Great Heathen Army. But Aella's eyes were fixed on the 4 men sitting on the dais, the sons of Ragnar. Bjorn Ironside sat with his massive arms crossed, looking at Aella like a butcher looks at livestock. Ubbe played with the handle of his axe. Sigurd Snake-in-the-Eye watched with that unnerving, unblinking stare. But the most terrifying presence in the room was the man who couldn't even stand up. Ivar the Boneless lay on a pile of furs, his twisted legs useless, but his eyes burning with cold intelligence. This was the moment the prophecy came full circle. Aella looked at them and saw the little piglets his prisoner had warned him about. But they were not piglets. They were wolves. Historical records don't give us a transcript of what was said, but the sagas paint a picture of terrifying intimacy. Ivar didn't scream. He didn't rage. He spoke softly. He asked Aella about the pit. He asked about the snakes. Did my father cry out? Did he beg? How long did it take for the venom to stop his heart? Every question was a knife twist. Ivar was forcing Aella to relive his crime. to admit that he had killed a hero without honor. Aella had denied Ragnar a weapon to die with. Now Ivar would deny Aella a quick death. In the Viking code, a clean death, a decapitation, or a sword to the heart was a mercy. It was respectful. But Aella had forfeited his right to respect. He was not a prisoner of war. He was a criminal who had violated sacred laws. There was no negotiation for ransom, no offer of exile. Ivar signaled to his guards. They didn't drag Aella to a dungeon. They dragged him out to a nearby hill. The time for talk was over. The sons of Ragnar had decided on a punishment that would echo through history. They prepared the ground for the Blood Eagle. The Blood Eagle, or blodern in Old Norse, is perhaps the most infamous execution method in history. For centuries, historians debated whether it was even real or just a myth designed to terrify enemies. But recent forensic analysis suggests it was anatomically possible, though rarely performed due to the extreme precision required. For King Aella, on that cold Northumbrian afternoon, it was very real. According to the sagas, the ritual served a specific purpose. This wasn't just execution. It was a message written in the language of terror. The victim was transformed into a symbol, a warning that would be remembered for generations. The procedure required someone with surgical knowledge of human anatomy. It was designed to maximize both physical trauma and psychological impact on witnesses. The process followed a methodical pattern that medieval sources describe in varying detail. Contemporary accounts suggest the ritual involved exposing the victim's back and manipulating the skeletal structure in a way that created a wing-like appearance. The name Blood Eagle comes from this final positioning, which was said to resemble an eagle with wings spread. Viking belief held that if the victim made any sound during the ritual, they would be denied entry to Valhalla. According to the sagas, Aella did not die silent. When the execution was complete, his body was left on display, not as a man, but as a warning. Every king in England would know what happened to those who tortured Ragnar Lothbrok. The debt was paid in full. With Aella dead and Northumbria broken, a normal army would have gone home. They had their revenge. They had their justice. But the Great Heathen Army didn't turn back to the sea. They turned south. The rage hadn't subsided. The momentum hadn't stopped. And there were other names on the list. In 869 AD, they returned to East Anglia, the kingdom where they had first landed. King Edmund of East Anglia had given them horses 3 years earlier, hoping to buy his safety. He thought he had a deal. But Ivar the Boneless didn't honor deals with men he considered complicit. When the Vikings returned, they didn't ask for horses. They demanded the kingdom. King Edmund was a pious man, a devout Christian who refused to fight a war he couldn't win, but also refused to submit to pagan overlords. He was captured near Hoxne in Suffolk. And here, Ivar decided to make another example. According to the Passion of St. Edmund, written decades later, Ivar wanted to test whether the Christian God would save his faithful servant. King Edmund was bound to a tree. What followed was described by medieval chroniclers as a prolonged ordeal. Viking archers were ordered to fire at the king, but not to aim for fatal shots. The execution became a demonstration, each arrow a statement of power. Throughout the ordeal, Edmund refused to renounce his faith or submit to Viking rule. This, according to the sources, infuriated Ivar. He had no patience for martyrs. Finally, Ivar gave the order. A swordsman stepped forward and ended Edmund's life with a single blow. According to legend, Edmund's head was severed and thrown deep into a forest, making burial difficult for his followers. King Edmund the Martyr died not because he killed Ragnar, but because he stood in the path of the avalanche. His death sent a clear message to the remaining kingdoms of England. There is no negotiation. There is no neutrality. Submit or die. By 874 AD, the Great Heathen Army had effectively conquered 3 of the 4 great kingdoms of England. Northumbria was a puppet state. East Anglia was occupied territory. Mercia, the massive kingdom in the Midlands, fell without significant resistance when its king, Burgred, chose exile over fighting. Only one kingdom remained independent, Wessex in the south. The sons of Ragnar turned their attention to this last stronghold, but in Wessex they found something they hadn't encountered before. They didn't find an arrogant tyrant like Aella, or a passive martyr like Edmund, or a coward like Burgred. They found a young man named Alfred. At this time, Alfred was not yet the Great. He was a sickly prince plagued by chronic stomach pain, often overshadowed by his warrior brother. But Alfred possessed something that even Ivar respected, a brilliant tactical mind. When the Vikings attacked in 871, the battles were brutal and inconclusive. Unlike the other kingdoms, Wessex fought back effectively. When Alfred's brother died, and he took the crown in the middle of a war zone, he made a controversial decision. He paid the Vikings to leave. A massive tribute of silver known as Danegeld. Critics might call this cowardice, similar to King Burgred's flight, but there was a key difference. Burgred paid to save himself. Alfred paid to buy time. He knew he couldn't defeat the Great Heathen Army in a pitched battle yet. He needed to reform his military. build ships, and study his enemy. He was buying 5 years of preparation. As the Vikings took the gold and settled into their conquered lands, Alfred sat in the shadows, watching, planning, and waiting. In 870 AD, after the conquest of East Anglia, the most terrifying man in Europe simply vanished. Ivar the Boneless disappears from English historical records. He leaves the Great Heathen Army in command of his brothers and fades into the mist. For centuries, this sudden silence puzzled historians. Did he retire? Was he killed in a skirmish? To find the answer, we have to look across the Irish Sea to the annals of Ulster. Here, Ivar reappears under the name Eamar, King of the Norsemen of all Ireland and Britain. It seems that after breaking the back of English kingdoms, Ivar returned to his stronghold in Dublin to rule as an emperor of the north. But the gods are known for their irony. Ivar, the man who engineered the Blood Eagle, the man who turned cities into killing grounds, did not die a warrior's death. He wasn't cut down in battle. He didn't ascend to Valhalla with a sword in his hand. In 873 AD, the annals record that Ivar died of a sudden and horrible disease. The man whose mind was a weapon but whose body was a burden was finally betrayed by his own physiology. It is a quiet end for a figure of such legendary violence. He died in his bed, likely surrounded by looted gold but defeated by biology. However, legend offers a different ending, one that fits the myth better than the history. According to Viking folklore, before he died, Ivar ordered his body transported back to England. He gave specific instructions to be buried on the coast, at the very spot where the Vikings first landed. His prophecy was that as long as his bones remained in English soil, no foreign invader would ever successfully conquer England. The legend claims that for 200 years, his curse held true. Viking raiders, Danish kings, Saxon struggles, none could truly take the island while Ivar watched from his grave. The story concludes in 1066, when William the Conqueror prepared to invade from Normandy. William, superstitious about the tales, allegedly found Ivar's burial mound, dug up the corpse, and burned it to ashes. Only after Ivar's physical form was destroyed did William launch his conquest. Whether he died of disease in Dublin or kept watch as a skeletal guardian on the English coast, Ivar's legacy was undeniable. He came to avenge his father and left, having destroyed kingdoms and fundamentally altered Britain forever. When the screams finally faded and the smoke cleared, the map of England had been redrawn forever. The revenge of the Great Heathen Army was complete. They had hunted down every person responsible for Ragnar Lothbrok's death. King Aella suffered the Blood Eagle. King Edmund was executed for standing in their way. The kingdoms of the north and east belonged to the Vikings. But revenge is a strange thing. It starts as a fire to burn your enemies, but often ends up forging a new world. The Vikings didn't just kill and leave. They stayed. They traded their swords for plows. The lands they conquered became known as the Danelaw, a massive territory where Viking laws, customs, and language took root. If you walk through York today or look at place names ending in by or Thorpe across England, you're seeing echoes of this invasion. Ragnar's death didn't just lead to the death of Aella, it led to the cultural transformation of England. The blood of the old boar and the blood of English kings mixed in the soil to create something new. Ragnar Lothbrok died alone in a snake pit, laughing at his killers, believing his sons would bring glory to his name. And they did. But they also brought chaos, and out of that chaos the Anglo-Saxons were forced to evolve. The Great Heathen Army thought they had won the war, but in the shadows of Wessex, the young King Alfred was done paying them off. He was building England's first navy. He was designing a network of fortresses. He was preparing to do the impossible, push back the tide. The sons of Ragnar had their vengeance. King Aella died screaming, but the question remained, could they hold what they had taken? If you want more stories about the forgotten battles and bloody revenges that shaped medieval Europe, hit subscribe. Drop a comment. Do you think the Blood Eagle was real or just Viking propaganda? And what other medieval revenge stories should I cover? Until next time, remember this. Ragnar Lothbrok died in a pit of snakes. But his sons turned that death into a weapon that destroyed kingdoms. The little piglets grunted, and England would never be the same.